Okay, so we can start. If you have any question, of course, you can interrupt me. This is the last session today. And we will see 2 chapters. Those 2 chapters are smaller than the previous one, so don't worry. It will be, I hope, an interesting session. And today we will see 2 main topics. The first topic we will see today is the extra financial performance. We will try to comment, discuss how to measure corporate social responsibility and to measure the performance of socially responsible investments. And we will see that extra financial performance is very difficult to measure. We have a lot of obstacles in the measurement of corporate social responsibility. In the previous session, in the previous chapters, we have discussed a lot about the definition of corporate social responsibility. This concept of CSR is difficult, but the measure of the concept, the measurement of this concept is even more difficult, and we will try to identify the main obstacles and how to solve them if we can. Okay, so the chapter 4 is about the measurement of extra financial performance, and we will have a last chapters, chapter 5, about responsible investors. We have already discussed green bonds and impact investments, so I will focus on responsible investors. In the previous chapters, we have discussed about the instrument. We have discussed the concept with a theoretical point of view, and then we have discussed the tools, the product. We have discussed about microcredit, about socially responsible funds, about impact fund, green bonds. But now, in the chapter 5, we will focus on investors, the motivation of such investors. We will have 2 parts. A first part, which will be brief, a first part about institutional investors, and then we will consider individual investors. Okay, so this is a program for today: the measurement of extra financial performance, and then the motivation of sustainable investors or socially responsible investors. Okay. Okay, so chapter 5. Chapter 4. Sorry. How to measure CSR. It is very important because in our society today, in research also, but of course in the financial industry, there is an obsession with measurements. Data is key today. We talk always about big data, and everybody seeks for new data, relevant data, uniform data. And this obsession for measurements is, of course, has of course an impact on CSR, because in practice, what we know is what we want to know is to identify the good company and the bad company, and to identify the most virtuous company, the good one. We need data to measure their corporate social responsibility, their corporate social performance. Okay, CSP. We have already used this acronym. So we have a very important question about the measurement. To measure is to know. You know this famous sentence. This famous sentence is attributed to Lord Kelvin, which is a long time ago, a very famous scientist. Okay. To measure is to know. So how to measure CSR? We have discussed about the definition. Now we will discuss how to measure CSR. As I said, we love data. Everybody loves data, in particular economists. Because why do we love data? Because we need data for research. Most of the economic literature is based on empirical studies. It's about 70–80% of the academic articles which are empirical articles. It was not like that 30–40 years ago, but now research is more and more empirical. So we need data, and especially we need hard data. And hard data have become the lifeblood of social science. Economists love data, but also practitioners, because they always seek for performance index or performance measurements. And journalists also, because they like to publish ranking of the best companies, the greenest company, which are usually published by newspaper or website dedicated to sustainable investment. So everybody wants to find new data. So we need data, but the literature on CSR is related to the measure of CFP instead of CSP. Let me repeat to be clear. If you need data, the easiest way to find data is to look at economic and financial database. It is much more easier to find financial and economic database. So it's why the literature on sustainable finance has focused on corporate financial performance. But now we need to find data, not economic and financial data, but extra financial data. We need data about E, S, and G, okay, about the three pillars of CSR. And to find such data, we can use the database which are provided by extra financial agencies. We have already talked a little bit about extra financial agencies. I will give you more detail about that. So the business of extra financial analysis has developed mainly since the late 19th, so it's about 20–30 years ago. And the aim is to assess the corporate social policies of companies, the ESG policies of the company, but not only the multinational company, also governments or any kind of securities issuers like local authorities, supranational bodies, any kind of organization. What we want to know is the ESG policies of all the securities issuers. And based on this analysis, the idea is to make a rating or a ranking in order to be able to compare the practice of the different issuers. And we need this data for issuer of listed securities, but also for issuer of unlisted securities. Okay. And these ratings are usually provided by dedicated agencies which offer such services. Okay? So they sell ESG rating or ESG ranking, and who buy such rating? Mainly management company that need such rating to elaborate their sustainable funds. Okay, so it's a little bit like financial rating agencies, but there is one main difference, is that unlike financial rating agencies, no financial rating agencies are paid by investors. This point is important. They sell to management company, but they are paid by investors. So the problem of conflict of interest is not the same for financial rating agencies and non-financial rating agencies. And those non-financial or extra-financial rating agencies use public data mainly, but also they elaborate, they create their own data based in particular on interview with the firms. Okay, so they can create new data, they gather public data and create new data also. I will give you a list of the main ESG agencies or extra-financial or non-financial agencies. All this terminology are the same. So the main agencies are MSCI ESG Research, which is a very large agency. MSCI made the acquisition of KLD, which is a pioneer in this business. So MSCI today is very, very large. In France, I have discussed a little bit about that. We have first rating agencies for ESG performance, which is Vigeo, Eris in the UK, which is an old one also, Oecom in Germany, InRate in Switzerland, Sustainalytics in Netherlands, Solaron in India. So it's mainly based in the US and in Europe, but they consider mainly the European and the US market, but actually the perimeter is not limited, and they provide also some data about emerging markets. But of course, it is a small part of their business. The main part is about Europe and the US. It is not a surprise. Okay. In addition to ESG agencies, we have also a certification. So you need to know about this certification. this certification is entitled ISO 26000, which is a new certification that can be targeted by firms. So the main characteristic to have the certification is about your corporate social performance, and the idea is with this certification to have a competitive advantage, to have a better reputation, and this better reputation will have, we hope, will have a positive impact on workers, on customers, on clients, on users. So it is a label. This certification is a label to have a competitive advantage, to increase your reputation. So it is very standard, not very difficult to understand. And there is one key aspect of this certification is that, of course, it is not a mandatory, but this certification is not really a certification. It is only a label. This company usually gives some certification for safety, for instance, but in this case, is not like a certification, is more an opinion or a label. Okay, so if you have this label, it can be positive for your firm, but ISO, this organization, does not provide any guarantee. Okay, it is important to note that corporate social performance and ESG rating are only opinion, only labeled. Okay, not real, genuine certification. Okay, based on this rating, most of the ESG extra financial agencies publish some index. So we have seen some of them. The mini 400 social index is the first one, and it is very well known, but you have a list of the main index here. For instance, the FTSE4Good indexes, the Dow Jones Sustainability Indexes, GENSI, ASPI, Calvert Social Index, so a very large number today, a very large number of socially responsible indices. I just mentioned few of them here, just as an example. Okay. A little focus on Vigeo Eiris. So Vigeo, as I said, was created 20 years ago in France, and then he merged with Eiris, which has been created before. It was two of the main ESG agency which has been created in Europe. So they merged, but since they have been both, they are part of Moody's today. So the creation of Vigeo, then a merge with Eiris, and now they are part of Moody's. It is important to have in mind this history, because you can see that from a niche, now they become mainstream. Moody's is, of course, very well known in the financial industry. It's a very large and a very old rating agencies, but it's about mainstream finance by opposition to Vigeo Eiris, which are more alternative, which initially were alternative agency, and now there is a global movement of acquisition in this sector. I will give you I will come back, but I just want to give you very briefly a short view of the different operation of acquisition in this sector. I will give you some references. It is very, very small. I'm sure you cannot see precisely, but it is just to insist on one point, is that we have a lot of merger and acquisition, M&A, a lot of mergers and acquisition in this sector. Initially, small firms which try to exploit a niche, but now mainstream agencies are the main players. Okay. So let me come back. So we have extra financial analysis provided by dedicated agencies, but we have also data providers, and the main data providers are quite well known also. Data providers like Thomson Reuters and Bloomberg, which are the main data provider in finance. Today, those data providers also provide and publish a lot of data about extra financial performances. So, usual data providers now publish sustainable indicators also, along with financial indicators and economic indicators. Okay. And then a third category. So first category, the ESG or non-financial rating agencies. Second category, the data providers. And the third category, specialized agencies. And I will give you just two examples. Trucost, which has been founded in 2000 in London. It is a British firm. And again, there is an acquisition by Standard & Poor's Dow Jones Indices in 2016. Trucost initially was a small firm. Now it is part of a very large company, Standard & Poor's Dow Jones Indices. And Trucost mainly publish data about carbon emission, your carbon footprint, the carbon footprint of the company. And they assess many companies across the world, and we will discuss about their product later. Okay, so Trucost is mainly specialized on carbon emission. And we have also another example. I will give you the example of Covalence, which has been created 20 years ago in Geneva, in Switzerland. Covalence publish data about reputation and reputation on internet and in newspapers. And we have already used this data. I presented in the previous chapter some research based on Covalence data, which are quite interesting, the data. Okay, so if you now look more deeply at the product, as I said, you can have rating you have an analysis of an insurer, a firm mainly, and usually you will have the three pillars: environment, social, and corporate governance. And for each pillar, you have different category. For instance, I give you this example for Thomson Reuters. You have three categories for the environmental pillar. The three categories are resource use, emission, and innovation. And for each category, you can have 10, 12, 20 criteria. So you have a lot of criteria in total, because for each pillar, you have several categories with several items, several criteria. And for Thomson Reuters, for instance, you have more than 70 criteria. 70 criteria for each firm. So it's a lot of information. Okay. And because they assess many firms, you can imagine that it is a very large database in total, because you have several dimensions. The temporal dimension, because you need to examine the score and the trend in the score. You have time series, but also panel data, because you have several firms in several sectors in several countries, and for each firm several criteria. So it means a very huge database at the end. And we will discuss very soon the different obstacles to manage such big database. Okay. So the first part of this chapter was a little bit descriptive. We have described the sector, we have identified the main agencies, and we have discussed a little bit about the product. It was descriptive. Now we will have a more theoretical approach. Okay? So if you have any question, again, do not hesitate. You can interrupt me at any time. It will be more theoretical now. Okay. So I will try to give you the different issues related to the measurement of CSR. And the key is to understand the multidimensional aspect of CSR. The concept of CSR is fundamentally multidimensional. And this is why we will see, this is why it is so difficult to measure, because you have several dimensions, a lot of dimensions. And just to introduce this discussion, just a funny quotation, you know, maybe about that. If you lie with your head in the oven and your feet in the fridge, on average, you will be comfortable. You will be comfortably warm. You will be comfortable. Okay? I'm not sure you think it's funny or not, but whatever. Maybe it gives you the intuition behind the problem of multidimensionality. If you have several criteria, environment and corporate governance, you can have a very good score in environment, for instance, and a very bad score in corporate governance. Is it possible to have an indicator which is relevant? It is very difficult, because in many cases, the average is not a good indicator. With this sentence, I try to give you the intuition. Average is not a perfect indicator. And the limit of the measurement of CSR is based on this idea. So it is, of course, convenient to compute average, but we will see that we have to make some very restrictive assumption, and sometimes average makes no sense. Okay. Again, at the same company may be environmentally friendly while at the same time behave irresponsibly on social or corporate governance issues. So it's very difficult to assess. And I can give you already one example, a very famous example, the nuclear industry. What do you think about the nuclear industry? For some people, the nuclear industry is not a good industry because of the radioactive waste and because of a possible accident. So, of course, nuclear energy is quite dangerous. So, for some people, again, it is not an environmentally friendly industry. But we have people who consider that nuclear industry is environmentally friendly because with the nuclear energy we can save oil and gas, and we can reduce, with nuclear energy, we can reduce carbon emission. So at the same time, the nuclear industry does well, and at the same time, the nuclear industry does bad. So it is quite difficult to have an average opinion. Okay. And you can consider a lot of different sectors. This problem is quite frequent, for instance, for the defense industry. For instance, in the US or in Europe, of course, or in Asia, we have firms which produce weapons, but at the same time, this industry is important for defense. So the first issue, of course, is to define what is sustainable and what is not. Very difficult to define, actually. And it is somewhat subjective to define what is sustainable and what is not. So we have this problem of multidimensionality, and most of the extra financial rating agencies overlook this problem, simply overlook this problem, and they aggregate the score of different dimensions of CSR, and they provide a general assessment. So they collect, I came back, for instance, Thomson Reuters, you have 70 key performance indicators, and you compute an average and you provide a unique score. Is it relevant? Not sure. Not sure that it can be relevant and useful. So we will see if we can improve such methodology. Okay. The problem is with composite score. So this problem about multiple objectives is at the heart of the economic literature on CSR. And it was the case since the beginning of the debate about CSR. And actually, the problem of multidimensionality is this problem was considered, but mostly when we need to compare the financial performance and the extra financial performance. Okay, so if we sum up the extra financial performance, imagine that you can have a single criteria for extra financial performance. We suppose that it is possible. You are a good company or not a good company. It's very simple, it's very caricatural, but let's do this assumption. So there is still a problem because you have at least you have two criteria, financial criteria and non-financial criteria. And because of that, for most part of the literature, in practice, CSR can be not a good idea. For instance, if you read Michael Jensen, who is a very influential researcher in financial economics, one of the most influential researchers in financial economics. For him, CSR is not a good idea. I just quote one of his famous papers in 2002. Purposeful behavior requires the existence of a single value objective function. Multiple objective is no objective. Okay. It's a very definitive statement. For other very famous economists, we have similar statements. For instance, in this paper by de Watrillon, Yewitt, and Jean Tirole, too many missions amount to no mission at all. Okay. If you want to be efficient, you need one goal, one mission. If you have too many missions, you fail. This is the basic idea. Okay. So this problem, of course, is at the heart of the academic literature when you compare financial and non-financial performance. But we have the same problem when we compare different pillars among non-financial indicators. The same problem arises. Okay. And again, I can give you some references. And for many economists, this the multiplication, the multiple objective is the main problem. For instance, for Hirsch and Levin, CSR is a broad concept or idea used loosely to encompass and account for a broad set of diverse phenomena. It is a very negative statement about CSR. For Rollet and Berman, because measuring CSR is contingent on the operational setting, it is difficult to produce worthwhile comparison across studies or generalizing beyond the boundary of a specific study. It is also quite negative. And for Chen and Delmas, because the full spectrum of CSR is broad, generating a proxy that can reflect its full scope is challenging. So, how to do to have a proxy, an index, a global assessment of CSR? It is a challenge. Okay, so we will we'll try to find some solution, of course. And for that, we need to list step by step the different problems. And the first one is about how to quantify. Assessing the level of CSR is difficult, and first, it is because CSR is very qualitative. When you consider the three pillars, environment, social issues, or corporate governance issues, it offers little opportunity for a quantitative evaluation. A good company, a virtuous company, it is not easy to quantify that. And corporate social performance relies mostly on soft measure. You know that soft measure, soft indicators, it's about qualitative indicators. And it is not always that we can use hard measures. For instance, it happened, but it is not always. But for instance, the amount of toxic release, you can compute exactly the amount of toxic release or the amount of emission. But for many cases, for instance, discrimination, gender discrimination or racial discrimination, it is not so easy to have a hard indicator. So we have a very large literature on that issue, and it's growing and promising, this literature on social and environmental accounting. I do not have time to explore with you this literature, but if you are interested, you can find some references about, again, social and environmental accounting. About the quantification, I will give you just two examples. The first example is the pay ratio. What is a pay ratio? Is a proxy for corporate governance or social issue within the firm. Within the firm. In the US, we have some rules based on the disclosure of compensation. To be clear, the Dodd-Frank Act, you know about that, it was just after the subprime crisis, and in the Dodd-Frank Act, we have some paragraph about disclosure, and publicly traded companies, so listed companies, are required to disclose two indicators. First, the median total annual compensation of all employees other than the CEO, and the ratio of the CEO's annual total compensation to that of the median employee. So you can measure inequality within the firm. And you can find the result in this website. And you can see very, very large difference between companies. For instance, the Gap Incorporation, you know about that, it is a very famous firm with a lot of shops everywhere in the world, you know about Gap. And the ratio, the pay ratio between the CEO and the median employee is higher than 3,000. It is a lot. Compare, for instance, to Alphabet Incorporation. You know about that. You know, Alphabet Incorporation is Google. Okay, mainly it's Google, and the ratio is very low compared to Gap or Coca-Cola Company. Okay, And why this ratio is low for Apple or Google? Not because the CEO is not well paid, but because the median employee is very well paid. So it decreases, of course, the ratio. And so this ratio is interesting to compare the firm, to compare the compensation policies of the different firms. But of course, you need to have in mind that it is always difficult to compare different sectors. So it's good if you compare within a sector, for instance, Alphabet and Apple, but not Alphabet and Gap, for instance. It does not make a lot of sense if you compare across sectors. So it is just an example of hard data which can be used to measure CSR performance. The US is the only country with such mandatory disclosure. In Europe, you do not have such mandatory disclosure. You have some disclosure, but it is based on less reliable data. So it is less relevant. Okay. Another example of data about corporate social performance. Another example. I will take time to describe this example, which is important, I guess. It is about carbon emission. You know, of course, about carbon emission. You know about the impact of carbon emission on climate change and the impact of climate change on the economy and the society. So the aim, and there is a very large consensus, the aim is to reduce carbon emission. But if you want to reduce carbon emission, you need to be able to measure carbon emission. So we have a protocol now to uniformize and to provide some guidelines to assess carbon emission. GHG is for greenhouse gases. Okay, so it's not only about carbon, it's about the greenhouse gas in general. Okay, so we have to measure it. But it is not easy because what is the perimeter? A very important question is about the perimeter. The GHG protocol standard consider 3 scopes. The scope 1 is the direct emission by the firm. And we have discussed about true cost. For instance, true cost measure the direct emission for each firm based on some disclosure by those firms. Not an easy task, but now we have some experience overall, and we have some relevant and reliable data about scope 1. Scope 2, it is based on the consumption of purchased energy, because it is not direct emission, but you have to take into account if you produce some iron, for instance, you need to buy a lot of energy, and this consumption of energy has a carbon footprint. So you need to take into account also this indirect emission. This is the scope 2. The scope 3. The scope 3 is all the other indirect emission. So it is very broad. very broad, over indirect emission. So we can classify the scope 3 in two categories. The scope 3 upstream, which are emissions associated to the supply side, and the scope 3 downstream, which are emissions associated with the product sold. So it requires a lot of information because you need to have precise information about the firm. This is the scope 1. You need to have information about the source of energy, the consumption of energy, and the nature of energy which has been used. And you need also to have information about clients' emission, about other firm on the supply chain. So you need a lot of information. For the scope 3, for instance, you can have in mind an example with the automobile industry. So, for the automobile industry, if you consider two kinds of vehicles, I'm not a specialist in automobile industry, but I will give you a very simple example. For instance, Peugeot. Peugeot sells small cars, usually. Okay? So you have to measure the direct emission by the factories, by the Peugeot factories. Peugeot is a French automobile firm, of course. You have to measure the emission by the factories. You have to measure the emission associated to the energy consumed by the factories. But you have also to measure the emission upstream, which are associated with the fabrication of the material which has been used by Peugeot. And you have also to measure emission associated with the product sold, and which is, in this case, is the vehicle. Okay? So, because Peugeot Peugeot sells small vehicle, the emission associated with the vehicle is not very large for the automobile industry. But now, think about the same, but for Porsche. For Porsche, you have the same scope 1, scope 2, but the scope 3 downstream for a company like Porsche, the scope 3 downstream is very important and very high compared to Peugeot, because Porsche sells they sell sports cars which consume a lot of energy and with a lot of carbon emissions. So if you are interested in the automobile industry, the scope 3 downstream is of course key. And at the same time, the scope 3 is the most difficult scope to assess. So we have to do a lot of work, and it is improving. But for now, carbon emission data are not really reliable, are not very reliable. Okay. I suggest you to make a break, a very small break, and I will show you some data about carbon emission after the break, and you will see the large difference between the the different company and the different sector. Okay, so I propose you to make a break, and we will see in 5-10 minutes. For carbon emission, it is very important to distinguish the different scope. So I will give you some figures about carbon emission, which has been provided by one of my colleagues, who is Thierry Roncalli. Okay, sorry, I interrupt just a minute. There is a question. Okay, there is a question about the assignment, so just I interrupt a little bit. You can ask questions about the assignment later at the end of the session, but I will answer. Sustainable finance is very broad, so it's why it's difficult to fix a perimeter. So you need to choose something, but it can be very large actually. So I cannot give you a precise answer. It depends. It depends. And there is one proposition: emission trading system in China and lesson for Vietnam. It can be a good idea. In this case, I accept it can be a good idea. Of course, you have to try to give a financial point of view, but it is okay in this case. Again, I cannot give you a precise answer. It depends on the topic, but for this topic, I agree. And I will recommend you to send me the topic before to start your paper to be sure everything is okay. Okay? Okay. So if you have other question, I will answer the question about the assignment. I will answer at the end, if you agree. But you can interrupt me if it is about the slide. So, as I said, some example of carbon emission for US and other company. Not only US, but also European company. So very famous firm like, for instance, Apple and Samsung. Will start with those two companies. So first, you need to collect the data about carbon emission. So you have to collect the data, and for the data, most of the researchers and most of the practitioners use the Trucos database. Okay. So you collect the data. Some data are provided by the firm, and some data are estimated by Trucost. And as you can see, you have scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. This is for emission. It is the amounts of tons of carbon equivalent. But in finance, and in economics, in management, we are more interested by intensity. Intensity is the ratio between emission and revenue, because we need to control for the size of the company, of course. You cannot compare a multinational with a small company. What is important is the intensity. So intensity is the ratio between emission and revenue. And then you can compare the firm. So first I will discuss and I will compare Apple and Samsung. You know those companies, their business is very similar. The business for Samsung or Apple is to sell smartphones and computer. So the business is very well known and very similar. But as you can see, the carbon intensity for scope 1 is very, very different from one company to another. The same for scope 2. Why this is the case? It is the case because Apple outsources most of the production, while it is not the case for Samsung. So because Apple outsources most of the fabrication, the intensity for scope 1 is very, very low. But the carbon footprint of Apple is similar to Samsung. So be careful with the data. You need to be very rigorous when you analyze the data. As you can see, for instance, for Apple, scope 3 is much more important than scope 1. And again, scope 3 is the most difficult scope to assess. But the amount is very, very high compared to the other scope. Okay? You can also be tempted to compare different industries. For instance, Apple and BP. As you can see, the difference between Apple and BP is huge. Because it is not the same sector. Of course, BP, the amount of carbon emission for BP is very, very, very high compared to Apple, in particular for scope 1, because it's about petroleum. So it is not a surprise. So in this case, you have to compare the firm within an industry. This is what we have called the best-in-class approach. You remember about the best-in-class approach. Okay. Conclusion. When you see the figures, the main conclusion is be careful. Be careful. The difference can be huge. Within an industry and across the industries. So be very cautious. Okay. So the first problem we have discussed is about the quantification of ESG criteria. There is a second problem about fungibility. So what is fungibility? To understand, we will make a very simple assumption. We will assume that the objectives of the firm are clearly defined. We will assume that the objectives are consensual and they are also measurable. So three very restrictive assumptions. But we assume that it is the case. It's very caricatural, but again, in this case, can we consider that a bad score on one dimension might be compensated by a good score on another dimension? It is a philosophical question. It is a very important question also. If you do good, can you do bad at the same time? Okay. Can a good action offset a bad one? It is unlikely. And we have not a lot of paper on that issue, but I will give you the reference of two key papers for Mattingly and Berman. Positive and negative social action are both empirically and conceptually distinct constructs and should not be combined. You cannot combine a good action and a bad one. Okay. For Kochen and Moon, there is also a problem because companies engage in corporate social responsibility in order to offset corporate social responsibility. Companies engage in corporate social responsibility in order to offset corporate social irresponsibility. In their paper, they find general support for a causal relationship. When companies do more harm, they also do more good to offset. Okay. So there is a problem with the fungibility of the criteria. And a third obstacle arises when it comes to aggregate several criteria. So this is a problem of commensurability. Fungibility, commensurability. The same company may be environmentally friendly, but at the same time behave irresponsibly on other issues. So to provide an overall score, you need to aggregate. And what tools can you use to aggregate? You can do some kind of average. But such aggregation between several criteria makes sense only if a good score may compensate a bad score. We have discussed about that. And there is another criteria, which is that to make sense, we should assign some weights to each criteria. So if you want an image, the problem is about adding apples and oranges. If you need to aggregate environmental issues and social issues, is like adding apple and oranges. Okay. So of course it's two fruits, but you have to have a clear definition and some kind of exchange rate. In practice, in economics, we use a price to have the possibility of aggregate in a basket different products. But when you discuss about environmental or social issues, you cannot have prices. So it is difficult to find exchange rate. So it's why you need to weight your average. Most of the time, we use equally weighted sum to compute average. And such equally weighted sum is very simple, but it can be improved a lot. For instance, KLD use 30 criteria. We have seen that Thomson Reuters use 70 criteria. And they do simple average. Simple average is equally weighted average. This problem is not specific to CSR. The problem of aggregation is very broad. In economics, we have this problem for a long time, and it has given rise to a very large literature, which is about multiple criteria decision analysis, and it is most well known under the acronym MCDA. MCDA is about methodology to provide some aggregation. Yeah, this is a very general problematic. When we discuss about sustainable finance, we do not have a lot of paper about this issue, but we have this paper by Chen and Dalmas, who propose to use a technique which is called the data envelopment analysis. And with these techniques, they can provide a composite score of ESG performance. I just give you an example of methodology to solve the aggregation problem when there is multiple criteria. Okay, the multiple criteria decision analysis sometimes is it can be very tricky, very sophisticated, and the simplest approach is to use a weighting scheme, some weight. And I will provide you an example. So it is not a real example, it is just to insist on the intuition. So imagine, okay, it's not for real. Imagine you have 3 firms and you want to analyze those 3 firms. So the first one is Big Bank, the second one is Super Oil, and the third one is Giant Store. 3 firms in different sectors. And you have 3 criteria, ESG. So you analyze those firms, and Big Bank, which is an investment bank in Wall Street, is ranked first in terms of environment because its activity is non-polluting. A bank does not pollute a lot, of course, because it is about services, so it is not very polluting. So the bank is ranked first. With this criteria, with the social criteria, the bank is ranked second. We don't know why, maybe because the CEO is involved in sponsoring contemporary art or whatever. It is just an example. And in terms of governance, the bank is ranked third, which is not good at all, because the corporate governance is not well done. In spite of the crisis, you have large bonuses distributed to traders. Okay, so 1, 2nd, and 3rd. For Super Oil, which is an offshore oil company, of course, with no surprise, you can say that for the environmental criteria, it is not good at all. So Super Oil is ranked 3rd, but in terms of social issues, the firm is ranked 1st, and for governance, it is 2nd. I will be faster. And then Giant Store, for corporate governance, it's okay. For environment, it's in the middle, but it's not good for social issues because, as you know, in such firm, wages are very low and working hours very fragmented. So, in any case, this is only an example, a virtual example. The first firm is ranked 1, is ranked 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. But this is the same for all the firms. So if you want to make a ranking, it's not possible. It's not possible to have a ranking for those companies. Okay. Because each of them are ranked, are classified first, second, and third. So it's impossible to rank them. There is a complete indetermination, and all those firms are well ranked. And of course, this is a problem because you want to avoid bad company, and you want to, on the contrary, insist on the good one. And in this case, there is no ranking. So the solution is to give some weight to the criteria. You can prioritize some criteria, and to prioritize them, you can give some weight. And the weight can be different for the different sectors. For instance, the environmental criteria is not important for bank, but for energy company, the environmental criteria could be very important. The social criteria for a retailer is very important, and so on. So you can decide to have different criteria for different sectors and different priority. Okay. So to sum up a little bit, what are the extra financial objectives of the firm? A very important question. We have discussed about that, and there is no consensus. No consensus between Milton Friedman or Jean Tirole, and I give you a lot of references about that. But imagine that there is a consensus. So you have to consider that the objectives are quantifiable. If they are not quantifiable, if it is not possible to quantify them, you have to prioritize some objectives. If the objectives are quantifiable, you have to decide whether they are fungible or not. Only if they are fungible, you can aggregate them. But to aggregate them, you need to ask yourself whether you think these criteria are commensurable. And if it is the case, you have to define some weights. So the process is not so easy. As I said, a lot of different hypotheses have to be made. Okay. Quantification, fungibility, commensurability. Very important concept. As I said, most of the studies in research assume equally weighted scores, and most of the extra financial agencies use equally weighted scores, while it is not very suitable. So to solve this problem, you have to use some weight. So the weight will not be the same for environmental issues or corporate governance issues. And second, this weight should be different for the banking sector and for the oil and gas sector, for instance. So you need weight, and you need specific weight adapted for each industry. Okay, so one size fits all. The hypothesis that one size fits all is not supported. You have to define specific weight for each industry. So I will skip about that. I will show you some different weighting scheme. For instance, for KLD, it was an equally weighted approach with different criteria, but all criteria have the same weight. Then they change the criteria, but still you have two categories of criteria, and within a category, it's equally weighted. The same for MSCI, but some papers, some researchers have provided some weights. For instance, in the paper by Vadok and Graves, which has been published 20 years ago, it's not very recent, but this paper is interesting. You can see that you have some weight. For instance, issue related to South Africa is underweighted, while environment is has a high rate. We have also a paper by Ruff and co-author with also a weighting scheme. For this paper, there is a priority on the environmental issues, but the weight are the same across all industries. On the contrary, for the rating agency GenC, the weight can vary depending on the industry. And you see the interval here as an example. Okay. So with a specific weighting scheme, you can aggregate the performance. But the question is to know who should set the weight. Maybe the CEOs, because they know well the company. Maybe experts, but which one? Which expert will define the weight? It's not an easy task. Or academics, but there is no legitimacy for academics to publish a weight. There is no consensus about the weight. Okay, I skipped this part. It's about a paper with different weight, and we have proposed to in a paper that you have in references. I'm trying to be a little bit faster. In this paper, we propose a weighting scheme based on the scrutiny of each firm. If we have more news about some firm, we will give more weight for the criteria which has been identified. So I will not detail the methodology, but as you can see, we have 3 different sectors, and you can see that, for instance, it is related to my previous example. If you consider bank in blue, you do not have a lot of article about bank and environment. Not a lot of article, but a lot of article about bank and corporate governance issues. If you consider basic resources, you have a lot of article for firm within the basic resources industry, which are about environmental issues, but not a lot about social issues. Okay, and if you remember my example, it fits very well with the previous example. Depending on the industry, the weakness of each firm is not the same. The weakness for the oil and gas industry is about environment. For banks, is about corporate governance. For consumer goods and services, it's about social issues. So you need to adopt a different view for the different sectors, and I hope that this graph helps you to understand that. Okay. Just a small comics, just to make a break, but you can read it after, during the break. You can have a look at this comic, and I hope you will enjoy. You can see also on this graph that you have a lot of good news and bad news for each sector. For banks, we do not have a lot of news, bad or good. For consumer goods and services, you have a lot of good news, but also a lot of bad news. Remember what I have said about corporate responsibility and irresponsibility. The paper by Kochen and Moon shows that when you have bad score, a strategy is to try to do good thing on another dimension to offset your bad score. If you have bad behavior in one dimension, you adopt a strategy to improve your reputation on another dimension, and the idea is to have a compensation between. But actually, maybe you do that. If you are not good in English, you are trying to have a good rating in mathematics, for instance. For students, it is quite well known to compensate the different grade. If you are not good in mathematics, maybe you are better in English, or the contrary, and you can offset. So it is possible for students, but for a firm, you have the same strategy, but I'm not sure it is debatable that we should allow such strategy. This one, okay, it is the same one. Okay. We have also different paper, but maybe we do not have time to see everything. There are so many topics to consider, but we have an interesting paper by Mazoutis about corporate social strategy. Okay, so you can have, this is not an experiment, it is an example. We have 6 firms with different criteria. You have 6 criteria and different ranking. Okay, so it is again not a real example. It is something which has been built. For the 6 firms, you have the same number of strengths. You have the same number of strengths, but the firms are very different. For instance, this firm has a very, very good score for employee relations. Okay. And the first firm and the 6th firm, so 6 and 0 elsewhere. But for this firm, in the bottom, you have 1 for every criteria. So the total number of strength is the same. It is not possible to rank the firm. They are equal in average, but the profile are very different between this one and this one. This one in the top or in the bottom. And it corresponds two different corporate social strategy. For the first firm, you have a dedicated strategy in one area, but for the firm in the bottom, you have a diffuse corporate social strategy with participation in all criteria. So it corresponds to very different policies. And Mazzutis provide this visualization of the different corporate social strategy. Of course, the best is to be here in this block. You are devoted with a deep approach in terms of social strategy, but also something broad, deep and broad. Okay. The firm number one at the bottom is located here with a deep strategy, but a narrow approach only for one criteria. And the firm number 6 at the bottom is here with a diffuse approach. So you can categorize the different firms and identify their corporate social strategy. Okay. Okay, we have almost finished this chapter about extra financial rating. So I will just give you additional references about ESG rating. I will give you the references of recent paper and just the flavor of this paper. So the common, there are all these paper, I'm sorry, all these paper share one aspect. They provide some critics about ESG rating. They provide some critics, a critical approach, and it's why it's interesting. So the first paper, Inside the ESG Rating. So this paper is about Bilio, Costola, Irstrova, Latino, and Pelizon. They analyze ESG rating criteria used by the main agencies, and they show that there is a lack of commonality in the definition of the characteristic, attributes, and standards. They show, to sum up, they show strong differences between the main agencies, and they compute the score for different firms which are assessed by such extra financial agencies, and they provide evidence of a strong heterogeneity in rating criteria. And it has a strong impact because sometimes they find opposite opinion, they provide opposite opinion on the same company. Okay. There is no agreement between the different agencies, no agreement. So it is a very important paper, a very recent one. The implication for the asset management industry is that it's extremely difficult to measure the ability of a fund manager. Indeed, financial performances are strongly conditioned by the ESG benchmark. So when we have discussed about the impact of CSR on financial performance, but if you measure CSR badly, you cannot assess the correlation and the causality between CSR and financial performance. Okay. So a strong disagreement between extra-financial agencies, and because of this disagreement, there is no impact on financial performance because each fund manager, each investor will focus on a different benchmark. So it will disperse the effect of sustainable investment. Okay, this was for the first paper. I give you just an example for Nissan, for different companies, you know, Nissan, Verizon Communication, or Oracle. As you can see, for instance, Nissan is ranked very well by Sustainalytics, but very badly by MSCI. And this is a contrary for Goodman, with a very low score for Sustainalytics and a very high score for MSCI. So you do not have any consensus on the performance of the firm. Okay, in this paper, you have the correlation between and the overlap between the different stock indexes based on ESG performance. I will let you, I give you the reference if you need more detail. Okay, so there is no correlation between the rating. And this is not the only paper about that. I go back. Sorry. Berg, Kolbel, and Rigobon also examine the divergence of ESG rating, and they consider the problem of aggregation. So their paper, I just here, to be very clear, I just give you the abstract of the paper. It was the case also before. So this is the abstract of the paper. So this paper investigates the divergence of environmental, social, and governance rating based on data from 6 prominent ESG rating agencies: KLD, Sustainalytics, Moody's, so Vigeo Eiris, Standard & Poor's, and Refinitiv, and MSCI. And they decompose the divergence. There is a divergence, like in the previous paper, but they decompose the divergence. And the different methodological aspects which cause the divergence. So mostly the divergence is attributed to measurement, to the scope, and to the weights. And the conclusion is that you need a great attention to how the data are generated. Again, I give you here the abstract, but again, I encourage you to be very cautious when you use ESG data. You can find here the correlation between ESG data for different pairs of agencies, for instance, KLD and Moody's, for instance, in this column. So, as you can see, you have some high correlation sometimes in green, but also you can have some very low correlation between the different rating agencies. Okay, so they compare, the previous paper compare the rating for different extra-financial agencies. Okay. But in this last paper, it is a comparison, not a transversal comparison, but a longitudinal comparison, because they compare the historical ratings. So they compare actual rating with past rating, and they show that you have a lot of change in the rating, in the longitudinal, with a longitudinal approach. They only consider one agencies, which is Refinitiv, which was previously Asset 4, and they show that the historical, there is a widespread change compared to the historical rating. Okay. So we should we expected some kind of persistence in the rating, but actually it is not the case. Again, the conclusion is the same, but I insist on that, but be very careful. Today, to be very brief, to conclude this chapter today, we do not know how to measure CSR. We do not know. It's very difficult, and it's improving, but for the moment, we do not have any clear indicators. Okay, this was the conclusion for this chapter 4. I propose you to do another break, and then we will have a last chapter, a small one. It will take 1 hour. The last chapter is about investors and behaviors. Okay. So a small break before the last chapter. And again, if you have questions, I'm still here. Okay, the last chapter, the very last chapter, it's about behavior. Okay, so we'll first discuss very quickly the case of institutional investors, and then we will talk about individual investors. So what is important for you is to understand that we have observed a radical change in asset management because of the modern portfolio theory. Thanks to the modern portfolio theory, we have observed a revolution in investments, and this revolution, we have already talked about that, is about the growth of the asset management industry. Usually we talk about the big three. Who are the big three in finance? The big three are BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. We call them the big three because they dominate the index fund industry, and they mostly use a passive approach in terms of investment strategy. So I give you this reference. Maybe it's better for you. I give you the reference if you want more detail about this big three. And in this paper in particular, they find that they constitute the largest shareholder in 88% of the largest US firms. So it is a very large percentage. The big three is the main shareholder in the main for the main US firm, and it is the same not only in the US but in Europe and in the world also. So it is very important that these institutional investors act in a responsible way. So you have this figure about the amount. It was in 2000, just 20 years ago, the amount of the mutual fund industry and the ETF. If you know about that, ETF, it's about exchange traded fund, which apply a passive investment strategy. So you can see that the growth is very important from 5,000, from 500 to 4,000. It is very large growth, of course. I need to precise the unit, but it is trillion of US dollars. And the main asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, have a very large total assets under management, and they mainly consider the passive approach. Okay. In comparison, investment bank like Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan Chase have a lower amount of assets under management, but they do not practice in a passive strategy. They have an active strategy. So you can see these figures are quite important, and again, it is a recent phenomena. 20 years ago, it was not so important. Okay, more statistics about the market capitalization for firm in the US. So it is not easy to understand this graph. This is in pink the amount of the US GDP, and the total column here is the total market capitalization in the US, and you have about 78% of the firm for which the big three represent the largest shareholders, and here it is the same but as a second shareholder. So it is a way to assess the importance of this big three. BlackRock in particular is the world's largest equity investors. BlackRock has 3,000 holdings in company greater than 3%, and more and additional holdings in company. It's not only, I'm sorry, I repeat, it was misleading. For 375 companies, they hold more than 10% of the market capitalization. And you can see the figure. It is for a threshold of 5%, 2.6 thousand companies and 3.6 thousand companies for a threshold equal to 3%. Okay, and in this case, because they have large position, large holdings, they can influence the policy of the company, and in particular, they can influence the responsible policy of the company. So you have today several papers which try to assess the behavior of BlackRock or the Norwegian Fund, which is another very important shareholder, and we try to understand the shareholder activism of such funds. We have discussed in the chapter 2 about shareholder activism, so I will not insist on that. Okay, and if you want to examine the case of institutional investor, it can be a good topic, for instance, for your paper at the end as an assignment. I recommend you some article, and if you send me an email, I can give you additional references, but we will not have a lot of time to discuss about that. Just remember that the main shareholders today are not particular, are not individuals. The main shareholders are asset managers and in particular institutional investors. This is one important aspect of the financial industry today. Okay, so it was very brief, but I will spend more time on the behavior of individual investor. The question is to understand why investors hold socially responsible investment, socially responsible mutual funds. So the best reference for this question is a paper which has been published in the Journal of Finance, but I will show you also different documents and figures about that. So some figures about France, because we have an important market for responsible investment, and we have also good data about that. So based on this data, I can discuss a little bit the motivation of responsible investors. The question is to understand who knows about socially responsible investing among the individual investor. Of course, in the financial industry, everybody knows about SRI. Everybody knows about that. But for individual investors, who knows? And who is willing to invest? And who actually does? Okay, I will try to give you some answer to this question. Again, sustainable finance is in vogue in a professional circle, but individual investors appear quite reluctant. So I use a survey. The name of the survey is PATER. PATER is for patrimoine and attitude dans le temps et le risque. So it's in French because it's a French survey about risk attitude and temporal preferences. So it's a very, very large survey of the French population. Okay, so in this survey, we have different questions about investment products and socially responsible investment. So the first question in the survey is about investment product. Do you have investment product or not? So do you invest or not? And then you ask to individuals, are you familiar with solidarity saving or socially responsible investment products? So they can answer yes, and I have already invested in this product. Yes, but I have never invested in this product. Or no, I don't know. And if they don't know, in the survey, we explain these products. So this product whose assets or revenue are intended, at least in part, to finance solidarity-based activities or activities that respect responsible investment criteria, may have a lower return. So we warn the individual that you can have a financial sacrifice. So the question is, would you be willing to invest in this product? Yes, certainly. Yes, probably. No, probably not. Or no, certainly not. So it is based on that question that we can compute the willingness to invest in SRI. So we can compare who actually invests, who knows about sustainable finance, and who is willing to invest. So the survey is about 12,000, more than 12,000 individuals in France. Half of them have investment products, more than half of them, almost 7,000. Half of people who have investment products know about SRI, so it's not a very large part. A lot of individuals do not know about socially responsible investments. And if you ask whether people are willing to invest, half of the people who have investment products are willing to invest. Okay. Okay. And people who have investment products, who know SRI, and who are willing to invest, it is a very small part at the conjunction between the three different circles. I hope this graph is clear enough for you. Okay. So the conclusion of this survey is that even if in finance everybody knows about socially responsible investment, it is not at all the case for individuals. So you need to communicate better about sustainable finance because people don't know about it, to say it simply. Okay, and the profile, what is the profile of socially responsible investors? It's interesting to see that, to see whether there are some differences. We have several papers about that. Again, it can be a good starting point for your assignment. You can try to build the profile of sustainable investors, whether they are more male or female, whether people live in a city or not. Do you think sustainable investors are more younger or older? Do you think there is a correlation with some kind of profession? So a lot of socio-demographic variables can be interesting to build the profile of socially responsible investors. You can also consider different characteristics about attitudes toward risk or non-risk adverse preferences. Okay. It is likely also that financial literacy is a determinant, a key issue to build the profile of socially responsible investors. So you can find different survey or paper about that, and you can try to sum up the different characteristics associated with responsible investment for individuals. Okay, I let you this for your assignment if you want, but you can choose another topic. And I want to insist on one theoretical point, which I think it is important to finish this session about sustainable finance. We will discuss about altruism and prosocial choices. So you have two important references by Jean Tirole and Roland Benabou. So what is altruism? What is prosocial choice? Okay, we will try to define that. First, we should note that there are some strong evidence about image concern. Okay, image concerns are very important. It depends on the culture, it depends on several characteristics, of course, but we have strong evidence everywhere that image, self-image is an issue for most of the people. And an example of that is that anonymous donations are widely considered to be the most admirable, of course, and yet they typically represent at most 1% of the total number of donations. This paragraph is from the article by Benabou and Tirole, and they contrast anonymous donation with non-anonymous donation. And anonymous donation, it is a very small part of the total number of donations. So it is, it means that altruism is not something easy to define, because when you are altruism, you need to be sure that people knows that you are altruist. Okay. So just to think about that with some relevant concept, I want to discuss with you about the ultimatum game. Do you know about that? Have you ever heard about the ultimatum game? It is a game which has been proposed by John Harsanyi, who is Nobel laureate in 1994. So it is an experiment in economics, a very popular one. So you can find some references on Wikipedia or elsewhere. It is very popular. So what is the game? What are the rules? You have one player, the proposer, and the researcher gives to the player an amount of money. And the first player, the proposer, is tasked with splitting this money with another player. And another player is a responder. Once the proposer communicates his decision, the responder may accept it or reject it. If the responder accepts, the money is split given the proposal. But so no problem. But if the responder rejects, both players receive nothing. And both players know in advance the consequences of the responder accepting or rejecting the offer. Okay. So imagine that you are a proposer. Imagine first that you are a proposer. Imagine that I give you 10 euros and you have to split. If the responder accepts, you split the money. If the responder refuses and rejects your proposition, nobody will have money. So imagine that you are a proposer. What do you propose? This is a basic question. And you have to think also and to ask yourself what will be your strategy if you are a responder. Do you accept an asymmetric payoff? Do you accept an asymmetric payment? I'm not sure. It depends on you. And I can give you some results, but it is interesting if you play the game. You cannot do it in practice, but you can think about it. You can think about it and you try to imagine your behavior. Okay? I will give you the average response. Okay. In different representation of the ultimate game, sometimes we define only two strategies, a fair strategy and an unfair strategy to simplify the presentation. So the fair strategy is the following. You will propose 5 and 5 if you decide to propose a fair strategy. If the responder accepts, you split and you have 5 each. If he refuses, 0 and 0. And you can also consider an unfair strategy, 8, 2, if he accepts, 0, 0, if he refuses. If you consider that game from an economist point of view, with a strict definition of rationality, which is the best strategy. If you are an economist and if you assume that players are motivated by the payoff only and that they are rational. In this case, the best strategy for the proposer is to propose an unfair split. And the best strategy for the responder is to accept the unfair strategy because 2 is better than 0. And in this case, you have only a fair and an unfair strategy, but you can let the proposer give any amount he wants. So if you just consider no decimal, okay, the extreme strategy is to propose to keep 9 and to offer 1 because 1 is better than 0. So the responder is inclined to accept it. Okay. This result is only acceptable if you consider that people just consider the payment and nothing else. But in practice, the players are sensible not only to the payment, but to the fairness of the strategy. And in most of the case, not most of the case, but in some case, when you propose an unfair amount, the responder refuses the amount. It is not rational, strictly rational, because he refuses, so he loses €2, but he refuses because he wants to punish the proposer who has proposed an unfair approach. So when you play with this game, you can see that individuals are not perfectly rational. No, I don't want to say that, but you can see that the strict financial rationality is not enough to understand the behavior of the player. The fairness is important, not only the payoff. Okay, we have a variant of the ultimatum game, a variant or a similar version, which is called the dictator game. In the dictator game, there is only one active player, the first player. The first player, who is qualified as the dictator, determines how to split the money. Okay, so the strategy for the first player is the same than before, but compared to the previous game, in the dictator game, the recipient has no influence. The recipient has only a passive role. He cannot refuse the offer. So it's why it is a dictator game, because the recipient cannot refuse. Okay. So in this case, we can imagine that the dictator is more inclined to propose an unfair strategy. And surprisingly, experimental results have indicated that adults often allocated money to the recipients, while it is not necessary from a strictly rigorous point of view. You do not have to offer anything because he cannot refuse your offer. So you just have to propose him the minimum. And if the minimum is 0 and you can keep all the money, you can do that because he cannot refuse. You are a dictator. But again, in experiments, and this experiment has been done several times, participants do not propose fair amounts, but they do not keep all the money for themselves, even if it's reduce the amount of money they receive. So fairness is important again, even in the dictator game. So it's interesting for you because we have discussed about sustainable finance, and sustainable finance, of course, is based on altruism, is based on fairness. So in this last chapter, I thought it was important for you to understand deeply those concepts. Okay. again, it is good if you can think about yourself. What will you do if you are a dictator? What will you do if you participate to an ultimate game? Do you propose something fair or not? It's important for you to know about your own strategy, your own behaviors. Okay. To make the connection with sustainable finance and altruism, I will propose you to discuss some variants. And Benabou and Tirole, in the paper I have give you the references of the paper. You can read it, of course. You have to read it. They challenge the idea of altruism. Okay, to sum up again, in the standard dictator game experiment, I said that many subjects are willing to make at least a small sacrifice in their own payoff to benefit others. So it's an evidence of altruism, a priori. But it can be more complex, and we have an interesting experiment by Dana and co-author, which has been published in 2007. In this experiment, they given the opportunity to the player, the opportunity not to know whether their action actually hurts others. And in this case, many people take advantage of this moral Regelung. This is the concept used by Benabou and Tirole. They take advantage of this to make selfish choices. Okay, so in some cases, in some contexts, you can be selfish, especially if you don't know whether your action actually hurts others. So, to be clear, the experiment is the following. So it is quite standard. There is a dictator game. It is a dictator game, so the dictator has to choose a non-fair, response A, or a fair, response B. And 3 out of 4 choose B. It is for a standard dictator game. And in the variant, the dictator does not know what the other player will receive, and he has to choose A. In case A, you receive 6, and the other receive 1 or 5, you don't know exactly. And B, you receive 5 as previously, but the other receive 5 or 1, and you don't know. Okay, so in this case, the dictator has the opportunity, we add this to the experiment, the dictator has the opportunity to find out immediately and with no cost the state of the nature. The state of the nature is 1 or 5, or 5 or 1. Okay? I'm sorry, excuse me. And half of the people choose not to know what the other player will receive. They don't want to know about that. They refuse to know. They refuse to see the result with the other player. So they can play A without any problem of image without image concern. So this is an interesting variant of the dictator game, which shows that you can be selfish, especially when the consequence of your choice are not clear. Okay. And of course, this experiment is interesting when we discuss about climate change, because our impact on climate change is very unclear. So in this case, the researcher, the academic literature shows that we are more selfish in this case. Okay. Okay, so it was a discussion about self-image, and in the context of sustainable finance, self-image is a good point, but also a negative point. So the good point for, again, it's based on the paper by Benabou and Tirole. The main virtue of social responsible products and their widespread diffusion is that they provide frequent reminders of things that we prefer not to think about, such as poverty, injustice, or the environmental impact of our consumption. Because you have impact bond, because you have sustainable finance, you cannot act like you don't know about the impact of your investment. So it forces you to think about that. So this is a good point. But the dark side of socially responsible investing is about the genuine motive behind your investment. Do you buy socially responsible investments assets because of image concern, or because you are really altruist? Well, it's very difficult to distinguish between the two. Okay. So about the incentives now to behave in altruist way. We have a very famous experiment based on blood donation. So it is based on a seminal book published by Titmus in 50 years ago. And in this book, Richard Titmus argued that financial incentives for blood donation might crowd out the supply of blood donation. So this is very interesting. Of course, blood donation, it's important. And I don't know, and you have to ask yourself, do you have already give your blood? Is something you practice regularly, sometimes? Of course, nobody wants to I don't know the name, to have a piqûre. I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know the name in English. A piqûre. Nobody wants. It hurts to give blood. It is not very comfortable. I'm not very comfortable with that. It hurts a little bit. Nobody really likes blood, so it's not easy. But we all know that it is important. We want our friends, we want our community, we want our neighbor to have blood if necessary. If you have an accident, you understand that it is important to have blood. So you can do it freely. And unfortunately, hospitals do not have enough blood. They do not have enough blood. So a way to improve blood donation is to pay for blood donation. It will be not a donation. It is not a. It is a payment. It is like a gratification, but it is not the price. There is no market for blood, but you can pay a little blood donors. And Carl Mellström and Magnus Johansson have tested whether a payment, a financial compensation, increase blood donation. What do you think about that? Do you think it increases blood donation? You know about the law of offer and demand. If you increase the price, you increase the offer. So it can be a good idea to give a compensation, but in practice it is not the case. I give you here the abstract of the paper by Carl Mellström and Magnus Johansson. They carry out a field experiment with 3 different treatments. In the first treatment, subjects were given the opportunity to become blood donor without any compensation. So, that's standard. In the second treatment, subjects receive a payment of 50 Swedish kron. It's about $7 for becoming blood donors. And in the third treatment, subjects could choose between a payment and donating to a charity. And the results differ markedly between men and women. For men, the supply of blood donors is not significantly different among the 3 experimental groups. So, if you give a compensation, it does not increase the amount of blood donation, for men at least. And for women, there is a significant crowding out effect. So it means that if you pay women, the amount of blood donation decreases. So you have to pay and you have less. So this is very counterintuitive, but a very important experiment about incentives. The supply of blood donor decreased by almost half when a monetary payment is introduced for women. Okay, so this is quite important. Financial incentives hurt. Financial incentives are not good in this respect, in this case. Okay. And in the literature about responsible investment, it's important you remember that in the chapter 3, we have discussed about the impact of CSR on financial performance. Fortunately, we have shown that there is no clear impact, but even if there is a positive impact, it does not mean that individual investor will accept more sustainable investment because of this crowding out effect. Okay. In my view, personally, I think that this paper by Mellström and Johansson is one of the most important papers published recently. This is very important because financial incentives in economics, it is usually a strong pillar in financial economics and in economics. It is a key in our theory. And this paper shows that financial incentives sometimes are counterintuitive. A last paper, a last experiment. It's about daycare centers. Okay. What is about this paper? Again, you have the abstract of the paper, and I will comment the abstract with you. And of course, always, as always, you have the references here. It is a field study in a group of daycare centers. Usually, I don't know if you have some kids. I have some kids, and usually parents used to arrive late to collect their children, forcing a teacher to stay after closing time because we are very busy, we have to work, we have to teach. So it happens that we arrive late. But of course, when the kids are very young, they cannot be alone. So a teacher has to stay after closing time. So it's not very nice for the teacher. We force her or him, to stay after closing time. And in their study, they introduce a fine, a monetary fine for late coming parents. So you can expect that because of the fine, parents arrive at time because they do not want to pay the fine. This is a very standard hypothesis, but it is wrong. It was the contrary. When they pay a fine, parents came later. When they have to pay, they came later because they think that the fine is a price. This is the title of the paper. A fine is a price. So if the fine is low enough, you say, okay, I'm very busy, I can pay in order to arrive late. It's like babysitting if you want. So be careful when you introduce financial incentive. It changes the framework a lot. When there is no financial incentives, you arrive at time because it's a good thing. It's a good thing to do. You should arrive at time because you are honest, okay, and polite. But if you can pay a fine, if you can pay a price to arrive late, it is no more a problem for you to arrive late. It is no more a problem. So it's better for you to pay the fine, to pay a price if, for instance, you are very busy. So again, this paper is another experiment, but the conclusion is similar to the previous one. And the conclusion is that financial incentives can crowd out moral incentives. So be careful with financial incentives, which again is a key issue for economists, but financial incentives are not the only incentives which are important for people. Okay, this is the text of the announcement introducing the fine. As you can see, they have to pay an amount if they arrive late. And the conclusion of that, I will show you the graph from the paper, and you can see that the group with fine, the late arrivals for the group with fine increased because of the fine. Okay. Oh, okay. I remember. Yes, I have. I'm sorry. I said it was the last one, but I have forgotten that there is another last paper. This is the very last one. I promise. Okay. So it was again an experiment about morality, honesty, and it is not about selfish attitude, but morality in the banking industry. So this is a paper which has been published in Nature. Nature is a very influential and well-known academic journal. So this paper is important, and in this paper they organize an experiment and they consider employees from a large international bank. So this is the abstract as always. At the start of the test, half the participants were quizzed about their job and their company to prompt them to think of their identity as bank employees. And the other half, to compare, this is the control group, the other half answer questions about their hobbies. So we don't mind. But we have a control group. And then the participants were asked to toss a coin 10 times. And they were unwatched by the researcher. And they have to report the outcome. So they play to toss a coin, like this. Huh? About that. About coin and toss. So you can do it 10 times. And if they win $20, but nobody watch. So at the end, the experimenter asked them how many flip, how many winning flip do you have? And if you are dishonest, you can say 10, and you will earn $200, even if it is not true, because no one watch, no one can denounce you, so you can lie, basically. And this is the answer. This is the answer of this experiment. In blue, it is the results if nobody lies. It is a binomial model if you play the game, so you can have a binomial distribution. And in red or pink, you have what people said. And of course, people lie a little bit. Okay? For instance, they claim that they have 10 winning flip, but it is very unlikely. And nobody says that he lost every time. So people lie. This is for the control group. But for bankers, they lie also, but more. As you can see, the pink bar are higher in this part than in this part. So you have more liars within the banking industry, because the banking culture is an important aspect of their identities. So it was a last experiment, which I hope you find interesting, about the banking and the culture in the financial industry. In the financial industry, the culture is give incentives for cheating, which of course is not what we can call a sustainable attitude. So to conclude all this session about sustainable finance, we have seen a lot of different tools, a lot of different products, but the most important aspect of sustainable finance is that we want that the banker, we want that the financial industry, we want a fair financial industry, an honest financial industry. I think it is the first step towards sustainable finance. Okay. It was the last paper about attitude and behaviors. Okay. I have finished what I have prepared for you. I hope it was clear. Again, if you have any question, you can send me an email. If you have any recommendation, remarks, comments, do not hesitate. It was a pleasure to provide all these materials. I hope it was clear. Sometimes it is not easy because I do not see you, so it is a very long monologue. It's not so easy, but again, I hope it was clear and thank you. Bye.